Get her off the stage. She's black. She's blind. She's going to ruin the Steinway. That was all it took. A public insult from a famous pianist. And the world almost missed a miracle. Ayanna Bell, the quiet, invisible girl standing alone under the spotlight, didn't respond. She simply sat at the piano, and when her fingers touched the keys, the world held its breath. What followed wasn't just music, it was a movement. This is the unforgettable story of a girl with no light, no fame, no stage, but who taught humanity how to listen again, with the heart. The crystal light fell like a cold blade across the magnificent stage of the Harmonique Theater in Boston, where sonatas usually resonated in utter reverence. Tonight, hundreds of distinguished guests dressed in tuxedos and evening gowns, major sponsors of the classical music world, gathered for the rehearsal of the International Harmony Gala. Amidst that glamorous setting, a moment was about to shatter the perfect glass they believed to be eternal. A young girl stepped out from behind the curtains. Her slender figure, dark brown skin, stood out in a simple black dress with no patterns. In her hand was a white cane, the symbol of blindness, but also the scepter of those who've learned to see with their souls. This girl was Ayanna Bell, 15 years old. Black, blind from birth. No fame, no agent, no introduction to the audience. Ayanna moved slowly, her steps hesitant yet fearless. As her right hand left the cane's handle, it hovered in the air, just inches away from the polished black surface of the Steinway and Sunsteed 274 at the center of the stage. Then, a voice rang out, tearing through the silence like a hammer smashing glass. "Get her off the stage! She'll ruin the piano!" The voice didn't come from a drunken audience member or a stranger. It came from Nathaniel Royce, the legendary white pianist, known as the frozen heart of American classical music. Dressed in a tailored black suit, the silver in his hair reflected the stage lights like a false halo. His eyes never left the girl, but his gaze was as cold as steel, a look that had once crushed hundreds of young artists with just a raised eyebrow. "She's blind. My God, who would let a blind, black, unknown child touch my $150,000 Steinway? This isn't a charity show." A soft chuckle from some backstage, a few quiet coughs from the audience. Some people turned away, embarrassed for him. But there were also silent nods, silent approval. No one stood up, no one protested. The entire hall fell silent under the brutality spoken as if it were an undeniable truth. But Ayanna didn't step back. She stood tall, lifting her head toward the voice, even though her cloudy white eyes couldn't see anyone. Her white cane still in hand, but she didn't use it to retreat. Instead, she took one more step forward, one step into the eye of the storm. She turned her head slightly toward the empty orchestra pit, as if sensing every gaze. Then, without a word, she sat at the piano bench. Nathaniel Royce almost roared from the wings. "Don't let her play. She'll make a fool of herself in front of the whole world." But Ayanna didn't listen. She didn't need to. Her small hands, once practiced in darkness, once trembling on old piano keys at the orphanage, now gently glided to the first key. Her fingers didn't strike the keys like a retaliation. They touched them as if touching a memory, soft, tender, but with purpose. And then, the first note rang out. Not loud, not flashy, but it cut through the air full of prejudice like the first light breaking through the darkness. And the world, which had just grimaced, turned away, waiting for failure, suddenly held its breath. Because in that moment, something unnameable began. The first sound that rang out under Ayanna Bell's fingertips was the result of a journey no one in that room had ever witnessed. A journey silent, full of darkness, and heavy with sighs. 2 years ago, on a dreary winter afternoon in Hartford, Connecticut, A social services van pulled up outside the Eastbrook Conservatory of Music, a place that only accepted the elite sprouts from prestigious musical families. In the biting cold, Ayanna, 13 years old, black, blind since birth, orphaned since she was 3, stepped off the van with a faded suitcase, a cracked braille reader, and a white cane that had been broken and taped back together. No one was there to greet her. On paper, she wasn't an official student. She was admitted through a humanitarian pilot program called Silent Observer. A phrase that sounded like charity, but was really a flowery name to legitimize her exclusion from all classes, performances, and access to musical instruments. In an environment where students were the children of U.S. ambassadors, grandchildren of Pulitzer-winning composers, and heirs of CEOs of the largest recording companies in New York, a blind girl from the welfare system was nothing more than a bothersome shadow wandering the marble halls. From day one, Ayanna learned to make herself small. She didn't speak. She didn't walk fast. She didn't knock on classroom doors. Instead, she sat huddled in the corridor outside Room 2B, where Professor Harold McCain taught harmonic analysis. She couldn't see him, but she memorized every footstep that echoed on the wooden floor, could tell when he tapped the board with his left hand instead of his right, and heard every note of the students' exercises through the slightly open door as they played on the grand piano in the classroom. She drew music by hand on her thigh. She learned rhythm by counting the steps of others as they left the room. And when she returned to her cramped dorm room, provided for the non-official students, she ran her fingers along the walls, recalling the sounds of the day. But what mattered most wasn't Ayanna's isolation. It was the silent complicity of those around her. The students never yelled at her, but they never greeted her either. They avoided eye contact, steered clear, and always shut the classroom doors tightly. One time, Ayanna accidentally walked into a practice room in the evening. A white student named Colton Devereux, the son of a state senator, sneered and mocked her in front of his friends. I wonder when the school started keeping pets. The whole room laughed. She didn't reply. She just stood there, her hand resting on the piano, and then quietly turned away. But the hurt from that comment cut deeper than any physical blow she had ever endured. Even the dorm manager, Janice Kettering, often hinted, "Ayanna, this is a prestigious school. You shouldn't make people feel uncomfortable." Uncomfortable. A word both soft and cruel. It didn't accuse, it didn't scream, but it dug deep like a mocking knife. Ayanna began to withdraw even more, but she didn't give up. Instead of fighting back, she listened more intently. She noticed the wooden floor of the third-floor practice room slightly sinking at the 4/4 beat, and that the second floor had a better resonance for the bass notes. She started to play music in her mind. No piano, no sheet music, no teacher. Then, one night after Professor Harold McCain's lecture, when the entire class had left, he came out and found Ayanna still sitting there, her hand hovering in the air, as if playing a silent concerto in the darkness of the hallway. He stood still. He said nothing. He didn't interrupt. Because in that moment he understood this girl didn't need light to see the music. That night, the rain fell heavily, like a veil blurring every light in the Eastbrook Conservatory campus. The wind howled softly through the stone corridors, where the heavy wooden doors had been shut tight for a long time. Outside, the Academy's elite students gathered in the Grand Hall, enthusiastically discussing scholarships, performance slots at Carnegie Hall, and recording opportunities for the upcoming fall, all things reserved for the chosen ones. But on the second floor, in a quiet corner of the corridor, a faint light spilled out from classroom 2B, casting on the silent face of Professor Harold McCain. Though retired, he was still invited by the school to return once a week to teach an advanced harmony analysis class. Not for fame, but for his love of the craft and the music he had never stopped revering as a faith. As the door closed behind the last student, he saw her, Ayanna, sitting cross-legged, her back against the wall, her hand raised into the air as if playing an invisible piece of music. She didn't know anyone was watching. She simply counted the beats with her fingers, moving each chord with the memory of sound, things she had never seen with her eyes, but understood better than anyone who had sat in that classroom. Harold didn't interrupt. He moved slowly until he stood before her, then spoke, his voice as soft as the deep tone of a cello. "Are you listening to my lecture?" Ayanna flinched slightly. Her white cane tilted to the side reflexively, but she didn't pull away. She nodded. "I'm just trying to visualize the fugue." Her response wasn't a justification or a plea. It was simply an admission, so sincere that Harold felt his heart tighten. He sat down on the step, right beside her. They both silently listened to the sound of the rain tapping against the window. Then he tilted his head to look at her. This black, blind, frail girl, with a dreamy yet determined gaze, and spoke a simple sentence. "Don't apologize. Play it right." That was the first invitation Ayanna had ever received from anyone at the conservatory. And from that rainy night an unspoken bond, not announced, but stronger than any artistic contract, began to form. The lessons that followed took place in the dark. No syllabus, no Steinway piano, no accompanying orchestra. Just an old upright piano in a basement storage room, where the smell of mildew from old sheet music still lingered like a mark of time. And only two people, a girl who had never been recognized as a student, and a professor who had once been hailed as a genius. Harold didn't teach with terminology. He told stories. How a fugue was like a pursuit of the soul. How a major chord could feel as heavy as stone when the context before it was a farewell. He tapped rhythm on Ayanna's knee. He showed her how to position her hands so her fingertips could feel the vibrations of the strings through the wood. He taught her to hear emotions, not just notes. D minor isn't always sad. It's just the shadow that falls when the light fades. And Ayanna, she absorbed everything like dry earth soaking up water. No need for repetition, never needing to play twice. But Harold didn't just teach, he observed. And what shocked him the most wasn't her extraordinary memory or frighteningly fast learning speed. It was something rare, even among professionals. Ayanna didn't play to impress. She played to survive. Music for her wasn't a goal. It was the only language the world hadn't stolen from her. When spring came, the leaves bent and stretched out from the old practice room window. It was also when Harold McCain did something he had never done in over 40 years of teaching at Eastbrook. He submitted a recommendation for someone who didn't even have a student ID. In his letter of recommendation for the Young Virtuosos Showcase audition, he didn't mention the word blind. He didn't mention black. He didn't write about struggles or overcoming fate. He simply wrote, Ayanna Bell, 15 years old. Music is her first language. Everyone else in the committee is learning this language as a second one. But Harold forgot one thing. Eastbrook doesn't read music. Eastbrook reads files. And a file without a family photo, without the names of parents, without financial contributions, not printed on letterhead paper, was a file that was off-tone before it even spoke. Eastbrook had an unwritten rule that every student understood. Talent is necessary, but the pedigree is the passport. And while children bearing surnames like Whitman, Devereux, or Langford studied music theory from color-printed sheets on silk paper, Ayanna, without a prominent last name, no Satie scores, no patron, learned through the wind blowing through windows, the vibrations of the wood when someone played out of rhythm, and nameless rehearsals in a dark room in the old basement. It was there that Harold McCain began lessons that would never be included in the syllabus. And it was also where he began to relearn himself, through the way Ayanna perceived the world. Harold didn't hand her a printed sheet of music, no metronome tapping, no invitation to practice this section. Instead, he gently touched her wrist, then tapped a beat on her finger like playing an invisible drum. Each beat was a message. Each note was a subtle knock. Ta-ta-ta. Silence. Long. Short. Then broken. He tapped her wrist to teach her to recognize syncopation. He taught her to feel the variations not by counting, but by sensing the air in her lungs when a note rang out at just the right moment, in the wrong place. D doesn't always sound like D, he said. Sometimes it's a waterfall. Other times, it's the silent sob inside the chest. Ayanna didn't ask questions. She never needed to repeat. She absorbed everything through her skin, through her muscles, through the rhythm of her pulse. And what made Harold shiver wasn't that she played correctly, but that she played truthfully. One evening, Harold described a Bach fugue as a man chasing his own shadow through the labyrinth of time. Ayanna listened, then suddenly played it back. Not the right notes, not the right tempo, but he realized she wasn't playing from the sheet music. She was playing from the story. He stood still, and for the first time in many years, Harold felt embarrassed for having once taught that ear training could be taught through formulas. However, as Ayanna progressed day by day, the quiet resistance around her began to grow. In the teacher's lounge, a few started whispering, "I heard McCain is teaching that girl privately. That's irresponsible. She's not an official student. It'll hurt the department's reputation if she shows up too soon." And then, Clarence Langford, the head of the piano department, who had once been called Royce's spiritual heir, invited Harold into his office and made it clear, "I know you value your project, but if it steps outside the boundaries, there will be consequences. Eastbrook is not a place for pity experiments." Pity. A word heavy as a slap. But Harold said nothing. He simply smiled faintly and left. Ayanna, however, knew nothing about those meetings. She just continued to listen. By that time, Ayanna no longer played according to what Harold told her. She began playing according to what Harold hadn't dared to admit. The regret, the loneliness of someone who had touched the peak of glory, only to realize that everything he had taught in his lifetime had never truly been heard. In one lesson, Ayanna played a short improvisation. No one told her to do it. She just felt she needed to. She started with a suspended chord, then shattered it with a low, cracked note like footsteps on thin ice. Harold stood still, tears falling without him realizing. Because he realized she wasn't just learning from him. She was healing him. And that's why, despite being obstructed, threatened, and isolated, Harold quietly sent Ayanna's application to the most prestigious audition showcase of the year. A file without a parent's name, without a patron, without a picture. Only an audio file attached. A short improvisation Ayanna had played with emotion. He didn't know that this would bring Ayanna closer to the light, but it would also place her in the eye of the storm of discrimination. When Harold McCain submitted Ayanna's audition file, he did not do what everyone else at Eastbrook would have. He didn't attach letters of recommendation from famous conductors. He didn't send a picture of Ayanna in a beautiful dress standing beside a gleaming piano. There were no pleas, no inspiring stories. He simply wrote briefly in the description, "Ayanna Bell, 15 years old. She doesn't read sheet music because she hears it before anyone writes it down." The audio file attached was a recording of an improvisation Ayanna had played in the basement one rainy afternoon. A piece of music with no name, no tempo measurements, no standard harmonies. But Harold was certain of one thing. It was real, and that realness, in this polished world of music, was something that was slowly being forgotten. A few weeks later, the school announced Ayanna was allowed to audition. Not in the main hall, not with a full panel of judges, not at a prime time with cameras rolling, but at 7:45 in the morning, in a small practice room on the lower floor A, with an old upright piano with a misaligned left pedal and only one unnamed judge present. An approval, disguised under the guise of permission, but was in fact a subtle rejection. That morning, Ayanna woke up at 5 a.m. She didn't eat breakfast. She didn't speak. She just sat silently in her room, her hand trailing over the edges of her old suitcase, as if retracing her past. Harold walked beside her quietly. When they reached the door, he took her cold hand and whispered, "This isn't for them to choose you. This is for you to decide if you need them." The door opened. The room was empty. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead. The judge, a middle-aged man, wearing a gray shirt and thin glasses, nodded as if he just wanted to get it over with. There was no name tag, no introduction, only the scratched piano with a soft, cracked sound in the mid-range. Ayanna didn't ask. She didn't complain. She stepped forward, placed her white cane to the side, and sat down. Her hands rested on the keys, as if touching an old scar. She took a deep breath and began Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, a piece that required both technical skill and emotional depth. For others, it was an exam. For Ayanna, it was a living memory, the nights she sat alone listening to a fuzzy recording from an old radio, then recreating each note in her memory. Her right hand painted. Her left hand told a story. Her cloudy eyes closed. Not because she was blind, but as if she were listening to the inner voice of the music instead of the audience. When the last note rang out, the room became as silent as a tomb. There were no applause, no "thank you." The judge simply nodded slightly, scribbled a few notes on his paper, and then stood up to leave. The door closed. Cold, with a sharp click. Ayanna sat there for a few more seconds, not waiting for anyone, but because she needed to listen to herself one last time. Did I speak? She didn't know that at the end of the hallway, in the dark corner next to the tech booth, Mr. Richard, the janitor of the conservatory, had accidentally witnessed the entire audition. He didn't know much about classical music, but he had cleaned the floors where Rachmaninoff had once performed, changed the lights when Duke Ellington visited, and he knew this little girl just played in a way no one else who'd walked through here had. Without thinking, he pulled an old phone from his jacket pocket, opened the camera, and quietly recorded the last 3 minutes of her performance. No edits, no filters, no commentary. Just a simple title, "The Blind Black Girl Auditions in the Side Room, but Makes Rachmaninoff Come Alive." And then he uploaded it to an old musicians forum he'd joined back in the 2000s, just so no one would forget this moment. The next day, Ayanna received a notification from the selection committee. "We appreciate your effort. Unfortunately, you are not on the official performance list this year." No explanation, no comments, no second chances. But they didn't know that by silencing Ayanna, they had just opened the speakers for the whole world to hear. The rejection notice from Eastbrook Conservatory arrived in Harold McCain's inbox as a 2-sentence email. No thank you, no explanation, no mention of how Ayanna had played. Harold printed the letter, folded it twice, and tucked it into a drawer. He didn't tell Ayanna, she didn't ask, They both understood. Sometimes silence is how the world responds to the things it doesn't want to acknowledge. But that silence didn't last long. 3 days after the rejected audition, the video filmed by Mr. Richard, the janitor with salt and pepper hair who had once been scolded by students for dropping his mop bucket, was quietly uploaded to YouTube. The video title was simple, with no gimmicks. Blind Black Girl Rejected by Conservatory plays Rachmaninoff from memory. At first, there were only a few dozen views, mostly from accounts that followed old classical music forums. A few scattered comments. The sound is a little muffled, but she plays pretty solid. Who posted this video? Who is she? Then, an Argentine musician named Marcos Villalba, famous for playing piano with one hand after a car accident, shared the clip on his personal page with the caption, "I cried, and I haven't cried for music in 10 years. Shortly after, a music blogger from Berlin reposted it on Twitter with the line, "If Eastbrook doesn't see something in this girl, the problem isn't in her eyes, it's in them." The spread began like an underground wave, not loud, no PR, no big names attached. But with every share, viewers stopped for longer, listened more intently, and began doing something even Eastbrook had never done. They listened, really listened. A hearing-impaired Japanese artist named Yuki Sakamoto felt the music only through the vibrations of the speakers pressing against his jawbone. He shared it with a Japanese caption that translated to, "She doesn't need to see the keys to touch me. I don't need to hear the notes clearly to feel her crying with her hands." In 72 hours, the clip reached 3 million views. No algorithm, no clickbait. Just one thing: the raw emotion that couldn't be taught, directed, or replicated. In the first week, music sites began asking questions. Who is Ayanna Bell? Which conservatory rejected this girl? Why was such talent left in the basement? Eastbrook, once a school that was only mentioned in artist honors columns, now appeared in headlines with keywords like discrimination, denial of black talent, privileged structures. In an urgent meeting of the board, Clarence Langford, the head of the piano department, angrily slammed his hand on the table. This is just an online phenomenon. A black kid playing instinctively. No technique, no proper harmony. The media is blowing this out of proportion. But the school's communications director, Sophie Travers, pale-faced, simply displayed a tweet from the International Music Institute on the screen. "We watched the video, and we would like Ayanna Bell to open the World Harmony Gala this year." A silence. It lingered, colder than anything Ayanna had ever faced in the music school's halls. Langford growled, "If she's invited, who will perform after her?" No one answered, because everyone understood there would be no after her if she truly found her voice. And in the small room at the nursing home, Harold McCain, rented outside of Boston, he sat quietly before his old laptop, seeing the notification, "Ayanna Bell invited to perform at the World Harmony Music Gala," opening the program, globally broadcast. He closed his eyes, not crying, just whispering. Finally, the voice that was never invited doesn't need an invitation anymore. That morning, before the sunlight had even crept through the window, Ayanna sat by an old wooden table in the small apartment she rented with Professor Harold McCain in the suburbs of Boston. Her fingers gently traced over a thick envelope sent via express mail from New York. The braille on the top of the envelope was clear. International Gala of Human Harmony, performance invitation. She didn't open the letter. She didn't need to. For as soon as her fingers brushed over the first lines of braille, her heart knew. This time, the world was the one inviting her. The International Gala of Human Harmony is an annual global music event held at the magnificent Crescendo Hall in New York, where luminaries like Lang Lang, Alicia Keys, and Yo-Yo Ma have performed. This year, the event would be broadcast to over 60 countries, with the theme Breaking Barriers Through Sound. Ayana Bell's name was placed in the opening performance slot, and the person scheduled to perform right after her was none other than Nathaniel Royce, the renowned pianist, a classical icon, and the very person who had once stood before hundreds of audiences, pointing at her and saying she was unworthy of touching a Steinway. When Royce received the official performance schedule, he nearly threw the paper on the table. A black, blind, unknown child. This is an arts gala, not an Oprah-style emotional performance. He didn't say it angrily. On the contrary, his voice was calm to the point of being cold. The kind of tone only those who believe their reputation is law, and they are the ones who define value, can use. Royce's personal advisor, a woman named Judith Carr, spoke softly. It's a request from the organizers. They said her video views have surpassed 30 million, and they want a symbol. Royce squinted. They want a symbol? Or do they want the moral high ground to sell tickets? The coordination meeting at the theater was tense, like a string pulled too tight. When Royce arrived, on time, in his coat, with his sunglasses and his authoritative walk, he went straight to Gerard Monroe, the artistic director of the gala, a sophisticated Frenchman who had managed hundreds of large and small music events and had arranged concerts for 3 U.S. presidents. Royce didn't say much. He simply stood before Monroe and dropped his words like lead. I demand the order be changed. I will not perform after her. Gerard looked directly at him. No blink, no smile, no lowering of his voice. You can withdraw, Mr. Royce, but she cannot. In that moment, something, not embarrassment but fear, leaked from Nathaniel Royce's eyes. Fear of what? Fear that everything he had once possessed, fame, power, monopoly, was slipping through his fingers not because of a rival, but because of a truth. Elsewhere, in the hotel near the theater, Ayana stood alone by the window of her simple suite. No assistant, no stylist, no crew. Just the sound of New York's wind sweeping through the 17th floor window, blending with the street traffic below, like a symphony without an orchestra. Professor Harold stood silently behind her, holding a simple performance outfit. A plain black dress, no frills, no embellishments. She touched the fabric, then smiled. It doesn't need to sparkle, it just needs the right sound. He looked at her, then nodded. But tonight, the world will listen to you in a different way. She tilted her head. Not through the eyes. Not through prejudice, but through what they've forgotten, with the heart. And that night, when the spotlight swept across the stage floor of Crescendo Hall, as the red velvet curtains parted and the giant screen flashed the words, Opening Performance, Ayana Bell, USA. The girl who had once been kicked off the stage for being blind. The girl who had once been rejected for being black. The girl who had once practiced in the old rehearsal room before dawn, walked out into the light, not to retaliate but to sing the thing the world had once tried to bury. The dull white lights of the rehearsal swept across the grand stage, not yet as dazzling as the night of the performance, but enough to reveal the scratches on the wooden floor, the patches of dust still clinging to the piano frame. Ayana stepped out, unhurried, unshaken. She didn't need anyone to guide her. All she needed was the hollow echo of her heels on the floor, the breathing of the technicians, and the stale smell of sweat from the conductor's chair. Silent cues that eyes could never see. She found her seat by the Steinway & Sons D274, the largest piano, regarded as an international treasure, reserved only for the top artists to perform. The polished surface of the piano reflected her hair and the world that had once rejected her. Ayanna sat down. She placed her white cane to the side, then, silently, she placed her hands on the keys. No sheet music, no metronome, no conductor, no one saying, "Start." Royce stood in the wings, arms crossed, his gaze cold, as though waiting for her to hit a wrong note so he could step out and dim the lights. But he wasn't prepared for what happened next, because Ayanna didn't play a famous piece. She didn't try to impress with the names of Bach or Rachmaninoff. She composed right there on the spot, a raw melody never written down before, not measured by staves, but by the elastic beats of a heart that had once been thrown into a dark corner. The first note, a long G, ringing like a distant call, soft and fragile, like the breath of a child searching for their mother in a crowded marketplace. Then, a series of broken chords, like tattered memories mended with tears. Her left hand struck the low chords, not just sorrow, but suppressed defiance. Her right hand moved quickly, not perfect, but painfully real, as if those hands were trying to reach out to a lost loved one. In the first 3 minutes, no one in the technical crew dared to move. The sound engineer stopped adjusting the levels. The light technicians didn't dare pan the lights slowly. The director stood frozen behind the podium. Even Royce, who had stood in the oldest concert halls of Europe, who had heard solo performances that obliterated even the most critical rows of critics, stopped breathing. Because he understood, and he was afraid, she wasn't playing to persuade, she was indicting. The melody Ayanna played didn't condemn with words, but each note that rang out was like the voice of everyone who had ever been rejected. Not because they weren't good enough, but because they didn't belong to the world of the suitable. The low notes were like the scornful glances cast upon her at Eastbrook. The high notes were like the lullabies her mother used to sing, now only echoing in memory. In the middle section, she allowed both hands to rest for exactly 3 beats. The silence made the audience hear their own swallowing. Then came the climax, a section that completely shattered the structure of classical harmony. Her left hand played a minor 7th chord, while her right hand struck an off-key note, not theoretically correct, but like a punch to those who had laughed when they saw her sit in the wrong classical posture. It was no longer music, it was an accusation. And then she finished, not with a piercing note, not with a complete chord, but with silence. No one spoke, no one clapped, no director's cue. Royce remained standing, his eyes narrowed, but this time he no longer saw a black blind girl. He saw a mirror, reflecting everything he had lost long ago, true emotion, real pain, authentic music. "She doesn't read music," he muttered under his breath. "No full score, no muscle memory. This is the original, pure. This is what I used to play, what I used to live, before I began to deceive myself." When the rehearsal director stepped forward, his voice hoarse, "Ayanna, was that your performance for the gala night?" Ayanna tilted her head, smiling faintly. "No, that was just the warm-up." And Royce, who had once considered every stage his own, no longer dared to demand a change in the performance order, because he knew this time the one going first would be the one who would remain the longest. The light of Crescendo Hall that night was not blinding. It was soft, like a breath, as if the entire stage knew what was about to happen didn't need to be illuminated brilliantly, but needed to be felt in the stillness. When the voice called out, "Ladies and gentlemen, opening tonight's Gala of Human Harmony, from the United States, Ayanna Bell." No introductory music, no drums to announce, no band frantically adjusting the tempo. only the sound of a white cane tapping lightly on the stage's wooden floor, each step steady, resonating like time slowing down. Ayana appeared, as simple as a whisper between the passing night and dawn. A black dress, no lace trim, no sequins, barefoot to feel the stage as if touching the cold memories of her childhood in the orphanage. Her left hand held the white cane. Her right hand clutched an old wooden flute, the only thing her mother had left her. Not because it was valuable, but because it was what she used to lull Ayana to sleep every night when the light had permanently left her eyes. She didn't bow, she didn't wave. She sat down, as if every seat should always be reserved for the forgotten. No microphone, no conductor, no stage lights sweeping in a circle. She placed the flute to the side and touched her hands to the keys, not to play music, but to open the door to the past. She didn't play Chopin, she didn't choose Beethoven, she didn't need Mozart to prove herself. She told a story without words, only notes and silence. The first note rang out like an unspoken sigh, then a broken minor chord, like a lullaby unfinished by her mother. Her left hand played heavy steps, slow, each sound echoing like the lost footsteps she took in the Eastbrook halls when she was pushed out of every classroom. Her right hand was gentle, like someone softly caressing an old scar. The entire hall sat still. Ambassadors, sponsors, famous artists, those who had once seen the gala as a display of meticulously crafted beauty, now sat as if they were students being taught how to truly listen. And then they cried. Not because she was blind, not because she was the first black girl to be invited to open here, but because they felt, for the first time in their lives, that someone was truly playing for them. Not to impress, but to share a pain they themselves had hidden. By the middle of the piece, Ayana removed her hands from the piano and picked up the flute. She didn't stand. She only tilted her head toward the wind passing through the stage door crack and began to blow. Not familiar music, but memories. The flute sound was delicate, not sharp. It quivered, like the voice of a child left behind, but within that quiver was hope, that if she could still make a sound, she was still present. The entire theater seemed to be suffocated by simplicity. Royce, sitting behind the wings, where he had once been the center of every gala season, gripped his seat tightly, his knuckles turning white. Not because he was angry, but because he understood he no longer had the language to argue against what was unfolding. It wasn't Ayana's music that was too perfect. It was too real, and the real doesn't need to be rationalized. When Ayana blew the final notes, not to conclude, but to accept silence as the most important part of the music, she lowered the flute, lifted her head, not to look, but to feel. No one stood immediately, because everyone was reassessing themselves. What had they just heard? And why was their heart reacting this way? Then, one person, then two, then the entire audience. They stood up, not for ceremony, but because they needed to. Not to applaud for praise, but to apologize for the years of silence towards voices like Ayana's. Harold McCain, standing silently behind the stage, removed his glasses. He didn't wipe away tears. He just whispered, "A girl who was never invited to sit has just made the entire world stand up." The morning after the Gala of Human Harmony, newspapers from New York to Tokyo ran headlines with phrases like, "Musical earthquake from a blind girl," "Ayana Bell, the new voice of the 21st century." Not a performance, but a wake-up call. The official video of the performance was uploaded on the Gala's channel and garnered 5 million views in less than 24 hours. But even as hundreds of thousands of comments flooded in, along with numerous interview invitations, talk shows, and million-dollar recording contracts being offered, Ayana did not show up. She didn't post anything, didn't open her phone, didn't accept flowers, didn't leave her hotel room. She simply sat in silence, her hands tracing imaginary piano keys on the wooden table, replaying everything from memory. 3 days after the gala, a senior representative from the prestigious Silver Sound Records, a label that had collaborated with legends like Herbie Hancock and Renee Fleming, came personally to knock on her hotel room door. He wore a sharp-tailored suit, holding a briefcase, a bouquet of white orchids, and a 30-page contract printed in gold ink. Ayana opened the door. She didn't nod, didn't invite him in. She simply tilted her head and spoke in a calm tone. "Do you know what prelude means?" The man hesitated. Introduction, I guess." Ayana nodded slightly. "Then what happened yesterday wasn't the story. It was just the introduction. And I'm not ready to have my name printed in the middle." No one understood why she turned everything down. No explanation, no press conference, no second appearance. The hotel manager reported back Ayana had left at 4 a.m. the next day, with Professor Harold McCain carrying only a small suitcase, her white cane, and the old wooden flute. The destination recorded on the receipt was Salzburg, the mountains. Meanwhile, at Eastbrook Conservatory's boardroom, the executives received a request from an anonymous sponsor. Offer a $2 million grant if a training program for disabled artists is established. The only condition, name the program the Ayana Bell Initiative. Clarence Langford, who had once rejected Ayana's audition and ignored all of Harold's warnings, sat in silence at the table. A New York Times newspaper was placed in front of him, with the headline, "She played 6 minutes." The world listened for 6 million seconds. And for the first time in his career, he didn't know which chapter he was in, or if he had already been left out of the book. As for Ayana, in a small wooden house deep in the Salzburg pine forests, she did not write music, did not perform, did not call her name. Every morning she stepped barefoot onto the cold grass, sat by the window facing the Alps, and listened, to the wind, to the insects, to the silence. "I'm not retreating," she had told Harold. "I'm just waiting for the right moment to begin Chapter 1. Somewhere, under the western sun, Royce, still performing, still standing in front of packed audiences, but inside, the music he played had become meaningless to him. Because after that gala night he couldn't help but remember one thing. I played to conquer the audience. She played to save people, and she saved me, even though she had never seen my face. In the misty pine forests of Salzburg, while the world was still trying to track down the blind girl who had made an entire international theater audience cry, Ayana Bell quietly chose a different way to be present. Not on the stage, but in the letters written from places where stage lights would never shine. It's unclear when, but handwritten letters began arriving at the mailbox in the small village at the foot of the mountain. At first, they were a few trembling postcards. Then came full envelopes, followed by stacks of paper tucked into old envelopes. They didn't come from producers, not from famous fans, not from the press. They came from a prisoner who had served over 17 years, writing with a pencil borrowed from the prison library. A 10-year-old girl with bone cancer lying in the hospital. A deaf boy learning to play the piano by feeling the vibrations of the floor. A father who no longer remembered his daughter's name because of his dementia, and hundreds of other ordinary people, those who had never been called by name. Ayana didn't reply with words. She responded with music, not with a PDF attachment, not with a recording, but with handwritten scores on old silk paper, with brown ink and unique notations, melodies that needed no rhythmic guidance, only to be felt. No one kept copies. No one registered copyrights, no one owned them, because each piece of music was a response in sound to pains that couldn't be named. Ayanna didn't sign her name. She only wrote one line at the bottom of the page, printed in Braille. Listen with the place where language has been forgotten. A mother who lost her 4-year-old son to cancer received an envelope with no return address, only the handwritten address. Inside was a score titled, "The Breath You Left Behind." No one could play the piece correctly, but when she handed it to a young pianist to try, the sound from the piano resonated like the breath held between a fitful sleep. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She just sat there, her hand placed on her chest, whispering, "You're still here." A prisoner in Georgia wrote a letter saying that every night in his cell, he would tap his fingers against the wall to recall the sound of his mother's piano when she was alive. A week later, the prison received a score with no composer's name, titled, "The Wall Remembers." The melody had irregular silences, exactly the rhythm of his fingers tapping against the cold brick. No one instructed him, but he played it again on the plastic table with the backs of his hands. For the first time in 17 years, he cried not because of his sentence, but because someone had listened to the sounds no one else could hear. The story spread not through the media, but from person to person. A teacher for deaf children used Ayanna's music to teach her students to read sound with their hands. A boy in a nursing home rewrote the final section of a piece of music and played it for his roommate who was dying. A young man with autism used the music Ayanna sent him as the soundtrack for his first YouTube video, a video about the feeling when someone can't express themselves with words. Royce, in another place, was still performing. But each time he played a nocturne, he would suddenly think, "Have I ever written anything?" just so someone could stop feeling invisible. Meanwhile, at Eastbrook, a blind student named Noir found an untitled score quietly taped to the door of the ensemble room. No signature, only a line that read, "For those who have never been chosen, but still dared to raise their voices." She played the piece at her graduation, and the entire audience stood up, not because it was beautiful, but because, at last, someone had spoken for them. Ayanna didn't know who posted these stories. She didn't know why the scores were being passed around, photographed, printed in local newspapers, played in churches, in orphanages, at memorial services. And she didn't want to know. "Music," she once told Harold as they sat by the fire, "is not to be heard. It's to let someone somewhere realize they haven't been forgotten." From Salzburg to Paris, then to Florence, invitations and telegrams continued to arrive at the small address where Ayanna lived in seclusion, but she never responded. Until one day, a thick envelope, edged in gold, sealed with wax bearing the symbol of an ancient harp, was hand-delivered via special courier from London. Inside was the official invitation from the Royal Council of Arts, announcing that she had been selected as the youngest, the first blind person, and the first person without any formal music conservatory education to be awarded the Artisan Prize, an award given only once a decade to an artist who has forever changed the way the world hears sound. Professor Harold quietly placed the letter on the wooden table. Ayanna touched the braille on the page, read it, and nodded slightly. "I will come, but not to receive. I will come to return the sound to where it began, a place where no one needs permission to be heard." The Artisan Prize ceremony, held at Royal Hall, a temple of the arts that had hosted legends like Benjamin Britten, Maria Callas, and John Williams, was now filled with guests from 94 countries. The entire hall felt like a silent choir, waiting for the moment that would redefine the entire concept of glory. The sign hanging behind the stage read, "A night to celebrate what cannot be taught." Ayana appeared on time. No escort, no extravagant dress. Just a dark linen cloak, bare feet, her white cane, and her mother's wooden flute. She walked onto the stage with the familiar quietness, like how the night would fall on the halls of Eastbrook, like how a child listens when the world doesn't notice them. No opening act, no applause. Ayana bowed to the audience, but not toward them. She raised her head toward the ceiling, as if greeting someone far higher, far away, who had taught her that music doesn't need light to sound. The organizers approached, handing her the artisan prize, a hand-carved crystal statue placed on a 100-year-old oak base. Ayana touched it for a moment, then gently set it down on the podium. She didn't hold it, didn't embrace it, didn't turn to the cameras. No speech, no acceptance of the title. She didn't need it. The world was the one that needed it. Then she took out the old wooden flute from its case, holding it with both hands as if lifting a memory. No microphone, no harmonies, no accompaniment. And she began to blow. A simple melody, unadorned, not fitting any pattern. It couldn't be defined by scales, couldn't be measured by BPM, couldn't be replicated by a MIDI file. It started with a low note, faint, blending with the sound of breath. Then it shifted into a series of notes like a lullaby broken mid-song, something those nameless mothers used to sing while wiping away tears as they held their children to sleep. Next came small, solitary notes, like the footsteps of those who never dared to step onto a stage. The entire hall sat still. Not the silence of formality, but the silence of a soul being touched. No one moved, no one blinked. No one dared to breathe loudly, because every movement seemed like it might break something alive in the air. An elder composer on the judging panel, eyes red, whispered, "She's not playing music, she's restoring it." And when Ayana finished, not with a climactic chord, not with a long, resonant note, but with a silence, stretching like an unspoken farewell, she bowed her head, placed the flute back in its case, and walked off the podium as if she had never stepped on it. No one clapped, no one stood up, no one said a word, because there was nothing more fitting to respond to a moment so complete that words had become redundant. The next morning, every newspaper mentioned her, but this time not with phrases like "goddess of music" or "phenomenon of the century." Only one phrase was repeated in every headline: the silence returned. That same day, the Royal Council held an urgent meeting. After 3 hours of deliberation, they issued a brief press statement. Starting this year, the Artisan Prize will officially be renamed the Ayana Bell Honor, not to honor one person, but to remind us of something that has been forgotten. Music is not for conquering the world. It is the way we return to ourselves. Even as the name the Ayana Bell Honor was etched into the history of world music, the girl who created it never appeared on any television channels. No CNN interviews, no Time magazine covers, no invitations from TED Talk, Oprah, or the BBC. She simply disappeared, as if she had never stepped out of the shadows of grand theaters. But then small pieces began to surface, not through cameras but through stories. In a small riverside town in northern Canada, it was whispered that a blind black girl, with her hair down and wearing a thick woolen coat, once taught an autistic boy who couldn't speak how to play music with his feet. She scattered rice on the wooden floor. Every time the boy stepped, the rice crunched, and she said, "That's the first beat?" Each morning, they walked circles together. When the rice stuck to his heels, when the wood made an unusual sound, when the silence lingered, the boy smiled. For the first time, after 9 years of therapy, he laughed with sound. In a Texas rural area, a deaf girl, born that way, known as the student not fit to study music, suddenly played her first ballad in life, not through musical notes, but through the vibration of gloves tuned to the music Ayanna had mailed. She didn't fully understand the music, but she understood why she should start playing. When a local reporter asked her, she simply said, "I didn't learn to play. I play to remember the feeling of someone listening to me even though I don't make a sound." No video, no live stream, no confirmation. But the story spread, no need for proof, just belief. Professor Harold McCain, when asked whether it was true, merely smiled. Do you need evidence if the sound is still echoing in your heart? Wherever Ayanna appeared, there were never VIP seats, security barriers, or flashbulbs. Instead, there was a volunteer class in a small church in Nairobi, where she and the orphans wrote melodies from their names, each child striking a note for every letter. A nursing home in Kyoto, where she sat for hours listening to elderly people recount the most beautiful sound of their lives, then turned those sounds into a symphony to send back. A bus station in Portugal, where she left a handwritten score hidden under a bench for those who don't know what they are waiting for. Meanwhile, at Eastbrook Conservatory, where Ayanna had been previously rejected without explanation, the winds had changed. Her existence, though never formally acknowledged by the former council, had forced every door there to open. The walls that once displayed portraits of white geniuses now had an empty frame, just a sign that read, "She didn't study here, but she taught us." The new curriculum, called Listening Literacy, required for all first-year students, began with an hour of silence, no instruments, just the sounds of the space, of the person across from you, and of yourself. One student asked the conservatory's new director, "Will Ayanna ever come back here to receive an honorary degree?" The professor paused. Then he pointed to the piano in the music room, where a handwritten sheet she had once sent to a first-year student was still stuck. "You don't need a degree to be called a musician. You just need the courage to play the first note when everyone is waiting for you to fail." And even though no one could see Ayanna, they could feel her everywhere. In a special class in Mexico City, where blind children painted rhythms with watercolors. On the train platforms in Paris, where street artists began each performance with a simple note, like a silent greeting. In the hearts of those who once thought music was only for the few. Ayanna never sought the stage. She sought the quiet places, where music didn't need to be proven, only born. And there, no cameras, no accolades, just one person willing to begin with the rhythm of their breath. The story begins at the place that once rejected her, Eastbrook Conservatory. The place where Ayanna Bell was once kept outside the classrooms as a silent observer. The halls that once echoed with the sound of a blind black girl walking past closed doors, no one opening them. Now, that place has a new door. After years of public questioning, funders pulling out and former students speaking out, the leadership of the conservatory was forced to face the truth. It wasn't that Ayanna Bell wasn't talented enough to be accepted. It was that they hadn't had the courage to recognize talent in a place they didn't understand. Under pressure from a petition with over 30,000 signatures from scholars, artists, and educators around the world, the Eastbrook Board agreed to create an entirely new teaching wing. Not as a form of atonement, but as an acknowledgement that music had truly been closed off from them. This project was named Bell Wing, the Unbiased Music Theory Wing. Bell Wing was unlike any building Eastbrook had ever had. It had no grand gates, no red carpet, no portraits of famous figures, no special classrooms. Instead, it had studios with 3D sound, allowing the hearing impaired to feel with their skin. wide hallways with no steps, equipped with light sensors for the visually impaired. A special music room where students play music with objects, not instruments, cups, pebbles, ropes, breath sounds. At the center of the building was an open courtyard, unroofed, with only a smooth white stone wall and a braille inscription, "Silence is not the absence of sound. It is where everything waits to be heard." There was no statue of Ayanna Bell, no portrait, no plaque, not because she was forgotten, but because her absence had become the loudest voice. She once said, "I don't need to stand in the middle. I just need someone to dare to begin the melody from where I have remained silent." And that, in turn, made her present in every first note of each lesson. At the inauguration of Bell Wing, Professor Harold McCain, now retired with silver hair, holding a cane, was invited to speak. He didn't speak for long. He only recalled, a long time ago, how he had seen a blind black girl standing outside the classroom door, listening with her fingertips placed on the wooden floor. Then he pointed toward the new building and said, "This is where the children who were once told, 'Music isn't for you,' belong, because they don't need permission to feel sound. They are the place where sound is born." Royce, the artist who had once humiliated Ayanna before a large audience, was not invited, but he came. He stood at the edge of the ceremony, unnoticed in the crowd. Only Professor Harold, as he passed, gently nodded in greeting. Royce didn't speak. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on the empty courtyard with Ayanna's words inscribed. And for the first time in many years, he took off his sunglasses and looked long at the absence, as if it were reflecting everything he had once thought of as music. In the first year since its opening, Bell Wing welcomed over 600 students from around the world, including 128 people who had never studied music, 74 people who were visually impaired, hearing impaired, or had sensory processing disorders, and 41 people who couldn't read or write, but knew how to feel. One music teacher at Bell Wing recalled a time when a student who had never touched an instrument played the first melody simply by placing their ear on the wooden surface while their classmate tapped lightly. Every morning at Bell Wing, the first piece of music played wasn't a famous classical piece, but an audio recording with no known composer. Only a line that read, "For the one learning to hear themselves again." The voice of the girl in the recording was unclear, but everyone believed it was Ayanna, and at the end there was only one whisper. "If you hear yourself, then you are no longer invisible." She had no statue, but every heartbeat of those who had once been rejected now beat in the way she had lived. Since the opening of Bell Wing, no one has seen Ayanna Bell appear in public. No performance schedule has listed her name. No magazine has captured new photos. No system has tracked her movements. But the world continues to tell stories about her. In Lisbon, a music teacher happened to walk into the public library and saw a blind girl sitting with a young girl, tapping sounds with an old plastic pipe. No instruments, no music theory books, just the hollow sound of the pipe, the resonance of the palm, and the soft laughter that filled the afternoon sunlight. The teacher asked if the blind girl was Ayanna Bell. The girl smiled, but didn't confirm. The next morning, on the teacher's desk was a handwritten score, with no title, no signature, only a small line at the bottom. No need to know the name, only to hear the echo. In Peru, in a village near the Amazon rainforest, an 8-year-old blind boy, while following Braille books in a mobile library, found a Braille music score. The village elder said, "It wasn't a book bought. It just appeared on the shelf like a breath left behind." The child played the score on an old wooden instrument, and when he reached the last note, he stopped, turned to his mother and said, "I can't see the person, but I'm sure they stood here." In Ghana, in a small village near the Elmina coast, the native drummers developed a new rhythm called Ayana Pulse. No one taught them. They simply said, "One night, before the moon rose, we heard a girl who didn't speak, but her footsteps on the ground had a rhythm. We just followed." Today, children in the village still learn the rhythm by listening to the pauses between two beats. Nowhere is there confirmation that Ayana ever appeared. No one posted statuses. No one took selfies with her. But her presence, like the heartbeat, doesn't need to be seen to know it exists. At a refugee camp in Syria, someone said they heard the sound of a flute at 3 a.m. as people were finishing an evacuation. The flute wasn't clear, but each note seemed to soothe the cracks in people's hearts. At a nursing home in Iceland, a housekeeping worker discovered a handwritten music score under the pillow of an elderly woman who had just passed away. No one knew who had left it. The score only read, "For those who once sang but no one listened." At Eastbrook Conservatory, a first-year student asked a professor, "Suppose I can never play perfectly. Does that mean I'm not a musician?" The professor looked up from the music desk, pointed to the space between two notes in the score. "Can you hear the sound in this silence?" "No." "Then you're ready to be a musician." "Why?" "Because the only person who truly understood that once sat outside this classroom." In New Delhi, Buenos Aires, Johannesburg, Oslo, New Orleans, Hanoi, people started having classes called quiet music labs, where students didn't learn to play music, but learned to listen first. Each class started with an agreement: sit still for 5 minutes, close your eyes, don't play anything. Then the teacher asks, "What do you hear?" And each answers a new piece of music that begins from there. Royce, now aged and no longer performing, he lives alone in a small riverside apartment in Boston, with only one piano, no longer polished, and a music score placed on the stand, written in Braille, that he can't read. But he plays it every morning, from memory, and with regret. He once asked Harold McCain in a seminar, "If I rewrite all the music in my life, just to make one girl, whom I once pushed away, feel accepted, is it too late?" Harold simply replied, "It's not too late if you write with what you've lost." Ayana Bell did not disappear. She blended into the rhythm of the world, in the sounds of poor children playing music with tin cans, in the sighs turned into melodies, in the first note of those who never believed they deserved to hold an instrument. One winter day, in a remote mountain village in Bhutan, a wordless music score was found hanging on the door of a small temple. No composer's name. Only one simple line: "If you hear something within the silence, then I was once here." And so, the girl who was once humiliated for daring to touch a Steinway not only made the whole world listen, she taught the world how to listen to itself. Ayana Bell never wanted to be a legend. She only wanted one person, just one person, to feel that they were no longer invisible. And then, from a public humiliation on stage, from a nameless piece of music, from an old wooden flute, she changed the way the world listens. What about you? Have you ever heard a melody that didn't come from sound, but from the deepest silence in your heart? Share with us in the comments below, because maybe your story will reach someone who needs it. If you felt something through this story, please share it with friends you believe need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss journeys that reach the depths of music and humanity, because there are some pieces of music that don't need to be loud, just deep enough to stay forever.